I was born in the heart of the American South, in a time when dirt roads wound through endless fields of cotton, and the sky seemed to stretch on forever. Promise Creek, Alabama, was the kind of place where everyone knew your name and your family's reputation. In the 1950s and early 60s, life out there wasn't luxurious by any means, but it was simple, and for many families, faith was both solace and law. We lived in a humble clay house with a dirt floor and a thatched roof practically invisible to the world beyond our cotton fields. But to us, that little house was everything. My mother Eleanor was a gentlewoman of tireless devotion. She spent her days washing laundry by hand for wealthier neighbours, scrubbing each shirt and sheet until it shone all to support her 4 children, 3 boys, and me. Despite her own worn hands and aching back, she never complained. Instead, she would sing an old hymn under her breath as she worked her voice low and soothing. My father Anthony, on the other hand, was a man who believed that love should be measured with a sturdy belt. He who spares the rod hates his child. He'd bark at the dinner table, slamming his fist hard enough to rattle the tin plates. In his world, fear bred obedience, and obedience bred salvation. In our town, the local church wielded more power than the mayor's office. It was a simple wooden structure with peeling white paint and stained glass windows that glowed every Sunday morning. At its head stood Father Joseph, a solemn man whose mere glance felt as though it could expose every hidden sin. He walked with a rigid posture and spoke with an authority no one dared to question. To many he was a saint. To me, he was another arm of my father's discipline. When Father Joseph declared something was God's will, it might as well have been carved in stone. In that world, faith was never just faith. It was a contract obedience in exchange for an eternal promise. But in practice, it often felt like a noose. We repeated our prayers on our knees until our legs went numb, and my siblings and I learned early on that any flicker of doubt or dissent was tantamount to disloyalty. My mother, head bowed, like a frightened bird, would murmur, "God is watching," whenever he raised his belt. And so we watched each other for lowered eyes, for hands that trembled, for a sigh too long or a question too bold. Yet in spite of it all, there was comfort in the ritual. The scent of old hymnals, the flicker of candlelight during evening vespers, the reassuring weight of my grandmother's wooden rosary in my pocket. All of these became small anchors in a whirlwind of fear. I would clutch that rosary tightly whenever my father's temper flared, reminding myself someday, some way, faith would also be my shield. Even at 14, I sensed the dangers of blind obedience. I watched neighbors hide their troubles behind perfect Sunday smiles, and I saw the wives who vanished into silence after a careless whisper. But I was young, and I had no language for what I felt. I only knew that every rule, every punishment, felt designed to shrink us into shadows. Yet whenever I tried to speak out about the whipping my brother took for dropping a jar of preserves, or the way Father Joseph humiliated Mrs. Callahan because her son danced at a picnic, my mother would hush me with a pained look. "We must trust God and his servants," she would say. And so I swallowed my words. Growing up in Promise Creek was like standing in a great oak's shadow. You could see the strength of its trunk, but you never felt its warmth. The church's teachings were woven into everything. School lessons, Sunday services, whispered gossip at Mrs. Baker's sewing circle. To challenge it was unthinkable. And as a teenage girl, I learned quickly that reputation was both armor and prison. One wrong move, and the entire town would brand you loose or improper. Even the hint of a smile at a boy's joke could send tongues wagging. I remember the first time I dared to question. I was 13, sitting in the back pew during Lent, when Father Joseph railed against sinners he claimed were infiltrating our community. Drunks, whores, and atheists, all bent on dragging us to perdition. He rattled off the names of distant cities where moral decay was supposedly rampant: New Orleans, Atlanta, Chicago, and spoke of how such corruption could spread like wildfire. My heart pounded as I glanced at my mother, whose lips were pressed so tightly together, I thought she'd vanish into her collar. After Mass, I asked her quietly, "Why can't people just believe differently? Why does God want us to fear each other?" She paled and shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "Honey, some questions are too dangerous," she whispered. I felt that moment like a slap, the realization that curiosity itself could be branded heresy. It wasn't until years later, when I danced with John the pharmacist's son and was condemned for it, that I recognized how deeply those lessons had carved scars on my spirit. But even then, I carried a kernel of resistance. In secret, I memorized poems by Emily Dickinson, whose verses spoke of quiet rebellion, and I buried a tattered paperback of Mark Twain's essays under my mattress. Those stolen moments with subversive books became lifelines, reminding me that the world was far larger than Promise Creek. Yet many of my friends never glimpsed that larger world. They married young boar children and accepted their roles without question. The fields needed picking, the church needed tending, and the community needed its orderly silence. That silence, I realized, was the greatest weapon of all. It convinced everyone that this was the natural order of things, the only path to God's grace. Looking back, I see now that faith can be a beautiful sanctuary or a gilded cage. The mistake so many of us made was confusing our reverence for the divine with reverence for the institution. We trusted the men in robes and collars to know God's will, even when their actions contradicted the mercy and compassion for they preached. We accepted punishment as proof of love and submission as proof of holiness. But faith, I have learned, is not about blind submission. It is about love, love for yourself, love for others, and love for the truth. True faith asks questions, demands justice, and refuses to accept suffering as an unchangeable fate. It compels us to speak out when we witness cruelty, to stand firm when power tries to silence us. In Promise Creek, I had no name for that kind of faith. I only knew that my heart pounded every time I risked a glance away from the strict path laid out for me. I knew that the cries of my siblings behind closed doors echoed my own unspoken fears. And even as I knelt on cold floors reciting prayers by rote, a small voice inside me whispered that there must be another way. That was the beginning of my journey from a frightened girl learning to bow before every authority to a young woman determined to find her own voice. It took years, and it took a tempest of trial and terror for me to understand that courage is born when we tear away the veils of fear. It blooms when we choose to believe in ourselves as fiercely as we've been taught to believe in God. I share this not to denounce the comfort of Sunday hymns or the warmth of community prayer, but to remind each of you, faith is a living river, not a stagnant pond confined by walls. If it ever feels cold or punitive, question its source. If it ever demands your silence, raise your voice. And if it ever asks you to surrender your dignity, run toward the light that knows no bounds. Because only when we break free of those gilded cages can we find the true sanctuary in our own hearts, and perhaps help others to find theirs too. Next, we'll explore the moment love became my spark of rebellion, and how a single dance under a summer moon set my path toward freedom. The summer air in Promise Creek carried more than the sweet scent of honeysuckle, it carried possibility. I still remember the first time I saw John Santos, the pharmacist's son, strumming his guitar beneath the oak tree at our church's annual picnic. He was tall and lean, with a shy smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He played Moon River in a slow, lilting rhythm, and when he glanced my way, I felt a curious warmth unfurl in my chest, equal parts excitement and trepidation. In our town, dating was its own delicate dance. There were chaperones at every gathering, and a boy inviting a girl to dance meant stepping under the ever-watchful eyes of parents and neighbors. In Atlanta or New York, teenagers slipped off to drive-ins or late-night diners. Here, the church lawn at dusk was as close to freedom as you could get. Still, it felt electric. As I stepped onto the grass, the damp evening dew cold against my bare feet, John reached for my hand. We moved slowly, cautious of every footfall, every spectator. But in that moment, nothing else existed but the soft strumming of his guitar and the gentle swirl of my skirt. When we parted at the end of the night, he pressed a folded slip of paper into my palm, his phone number and a single line. "Meet me, Kiahemk, next Friday." My heart fluttered. Every step home felt like walking on clouds, but each footfall was haunted by my father's voice. A girl who dances before marriage brings shame. Yet when I told my mother, she only sighed and closed her eyes as if she knew the dilemma I faced but had no solution beyond silent prayers. Over the next week, I studied our small town's unspoken code. There were those who had courted and survived unscathed Mary Ann, and her high school sweetheart now engaged to marry after graduation. But plenty of others had stumbled. I heard whispers of Lucy Baker, who'd been sent away to her aunt's in Birmingham after a single kiss. I saw the way other girls turned their heads when John and I walked by, lips pursed, eyebrows raised. It felt as if every step I took with him was under a magnifying glass. On that second Friday, I found John leaning against the same oak guitar, slung casually over his shoulder. Beneath him, a plaid blanket held 2 peach-filled bottles of soda and a pack of salted peanuts. He stood and offered me a glass, his smooth fingers brushing my hand. We laughed as seeds fell onto the blanket, picking them up slowly, talking about trivial things. Our favorite hymns, mine was Amazing Grace, his Be Thou My Vision. Our secret ambitions, mine to teach, his to study chemistry. Then he told me about life beyond Promise Creek College football games in Tuscaloosa libraries, in Montgomery chemistry labs at Auburn University. I hung on every word. It was the first time I realized just how small my world had been. He didn't mock my hometown. He spoke of it with fondness. Yet it was clear his dreams extended further. And I felt torn because my heart was tethered to this soil. And yet it yearned to explore. Our dance that night at the church festival was the same as before, only slower, more intimate. His hands rested just above my waist, and I felt safe in his grasp. Under the lanterns and holy banners, the music swelled, and I dared to hope this sweetness could last. But small towns are not kind to hope. It only takes a displaced word or an envious glance to start a fire. 2 days later, Tony the priest's nephew, the same boy who passed out hymnals, caught sight of us at the general store laughing too closely over a shared joke. By the next morning, gossip had become gospel. Grace Peterson is throwing herself at John Santos. My father's rage arrived before I could warn John. At breakfast, his face was red as even my mother's tears could not soften his voice. "You've disgraced our family," he thundered, sending my plate flying. "There's only one way to clean this stain." I felt my mother reach for my hand under the table, her skin cold with fear. But she said nothing. In our world, to question a man's word was to question God's. Within hours, Father Joseph stood at our doorway, his black robes heavy in the midday sun. He sipped Eleanor's trembling coffee and fixed his gaze on me. "God has called you to a higher purpose," he declared with that same unwavering authority. "You will leave Promise Creek and take the veil at St. Jude's Abbey." Shock was a brief reprieve before my spirit shattered. I tried to explain I wanted to be a teacher, to laugh freely with John, to continue learning, but Father Joseph and my father shared a look of divine certainty. The convent would purify me. My mother's tears were silent on the sidelines, and I understood for the first time the cruel bargain that bound her own will, handed over in exchange for peace. In the days that followed, I stole moments to meet John behind the old barn. He held me close, his voice trembling as he whispered, "I'll wait for you no matter how long." I clung to the warmth in his eyes, tasting the sweetness of that promise. But I also knew how fragile hope could be here. If other girls had vanished for a single kiss, what chance did I have? On the morning I left, I packed a small bundle, my favorite blue dress, a wooden rosary from my grandmother, and a battered copy of Twain's essays. I hugged Rosie, my childhood ragdoll, and kissed my mother's forehead, tasting salt on her cheek. John met me at the edge of town, his eyes red and fierce. He pressed another slip of paper into my hand. His address in Atlanta, and said, "Write to me, Grace. I'll be your lifeline." The journey to St. Jude's Abbey was a blur of rattling trucks and dusty train cars. With every mile, I felt the world I knew slipping behind me. I turned back once, half expecting John to remain on the platform, still waiting. But when I looked, there was only the station master calling for tickets. When I arrived, the convent's high walls seemed designed to crush hope. At the gate, Sister Angelica's steely eyes met mine, and with a word, I became Sister Mary of divine obedience. My hair was shaved, my belongings stripped away, replaced by a rough, itchy habit. In the mirror of that barren cell, I hardly recognized the girl who danced under lantern light. Yet even amid the cold water and cold stares, I clung to John's promise. Every letter I wrote folded hope into the margins. "I miss you. I love you. Pray for me." And every letter I received from him from no one else returned the same line, "I'll be here, sister, or not." Looking back, their punishment was not just in the convent's discipline, but in severing the bridge between worlds. For John represented possibility of love, unchecked by guilt of ambition, fueled by curiosity of a future not dictated by whispers. The convent's walls were meant to erase those dreams. Instead, they honed my resolve. In a church that preached obedience as the highest virtue, our silent affection became an act of rebellion. It illuminated the chasm between faith as comfort and faith as coercion. And while Father Joseph believed he had guided me toward divine purpose, John taught me what purpose truly meant, choosing who you love and who you become, rather than allowing someone else to decide for you. That summer dance under the oak tree was more than a young girl's folly. It was a spark that would set my life ablaze, leading me through fear, through exile, and ultimately toward freedom. And somewhere beyond those convent walls, I held on to the belief that love, like a river, finds its way through even the most fortified barriers. Next, I will tell you how I survived the sunless days of the convent, how small acts of kindness kept my spirit alive, and how that river within me refused to be dammed, even when I was stripped of my name, my home, and almost my hope. I still remember the first morning at St. Jude's Abbey, as though it were yesterday. The sun had not yet risen when the bell clanged through the silent courtyard at 4:00 a.m., rousing me from an uneasy doze on the thin mattress. My head ached from the cold bath and the rough habit that now hid my hair chopped down to a shield of stubble. In the dim lantern light, I followed Sister Angelica's stiff silhouette down the narrow corridor, praying that my knees, long unused to such hours, would not betray me with a groan. At sunrise, we knelt on the unforgiving stone floor for the first of 3 daily prayer services. Each Hail Mary and Our Father came with a distinct sting, not just of cold air against my bare skin, but of shame drilled into me by decades of dogma. The abbey's walls, thick with damp and moss, seemed to hold every whispered confession and every suppressed sob. I learned quickly in this house of God, silence was the deadliest commandment. After prayers, we fell in line for breakfast, a single slice of stale bread and a thimbleful of milk watered thin. The ritual wasn't merely about sustenance. It was a lesson in obedience, how little we needed, how much we must endure. At the refectory table, Sister Agnes presided with watchful eyes, her cane, tapping softly as she reminded us. A closed mouth catches no flies. No one dared to speak above a whisper, and even that could earn you a night of extra prayers in your cell. The work followed scrubbing floors until my hands bled sewing hundreds of garments for distant hospitals, weeding the garden in silence. My fingernails cracked and my shoulders ached from stooping over patchwork. Each task was assigned without regard for skill or comfort. Sister Angelica believed that humility was born of suffering. One afternoon I watched as a fellow novice, Teresa, shuffled across the courtyard, her eyes haunted and hollow. She'd arrived months before me and already moved deeper into despair. I tried to catch her gaze to offer solidarity, but she turned away. By nightfall, Sister Agnes had confiscated Teresa's rosary and locked her in solitary for lack of devotion. The next morning her cheeks were streaked with tears, her voice barely more than a whisper. In her trembling hands, I saw the proof. Tiny bruises, like the imprints of cold chains. It was during my second week that I first confronted the legal reality of what was happening. Our lives, I learned, were protected by no civil statute. Religious institutions in mid-century America operated largely unchecked. Reports of convent abuse existed in whispers, buried under the weight of public reverence for the church. I recalled stories I'd heard in Promise Creek of priests relocated quietly rather than exposed, of families too terrified to speak out. Here in these stone cloisters, I felt the truth. For the first time, we were as vulnerable as children in an orphanage without oversight, yet bound by vows we had not freely chosen. In the afternoons, a select few of us attended catechism classes led by Father Anselm, whose reputation for severity rivaled that of any judge. He spoke of sin as though it were a contagious disease, detailing punishments divine and temporal with equal enthusiasm. One afternoon, after I confessed to missing my family, I was summoned to the Mother Superior's office. Sister Angelica's gentle face was gone, replaced by a stern mask. "You waste your prayers on earthly attachments," she intoned, tapping a ruler against the desk. "We are here for God's work." 10 swift strikes fell across my palms, and I bit down hard on my habit to stifle my scream. I tasted iron and ash, tasting the truth that my own flesh would be the instrument of my correction. "Give thanks for this correction." She snapped, her voice as unforgiving as the marble floor. In those moments I understood how the Abbey wielded its authority, not with the promise of mercy, but with the threat of perpetual shame. We were taught that loyalty was proven through pain, and that pain was a sign of divine favor. If you survived the lashes, you earned your place. If you groaned, you risked being labeled weak. My only solace came in brief glances from Rose, a fellow novice assigned to laundry duty alongside me. In the steam and soap suds, her eyes burned with an intelligence that outshone the grey cinder-block walls. One evening, she pressed a scrap of paper into my hand. "Be careful what you say in confession." I stared at the shaky scrawl, stunned. "Confession is where sins are purged," I whispered. She shook her head, her expression grave. "It's where they collect your secrets to punish you." I did not believe her until the next morning, when details from my private words, my longing for home, my fear of this place were woven into a public reprimand at prayer. The Mother Superior called me forward, her voice echoing in the chapel. "You must uproot these sinful distractions," she proclaimed. My cheeks burned as every head turned toward me. I realized then that our confessions were not sacred. They were dossiers carefully maintained by a system that thrived on control. I tried to assert myself to ask why the rule book of the church trusted men in cassocks with our bodies and souls while denying us basic compassion. But my voice cracked and the sisters shook their heads. Charity begins with obedience, they intoned in unison. I swallowed my pride and my words once more. In private, I began to collect scraps of information. I memorized the schedule of nuns' visits, noted which doors remained unlocked at certain hours, and catalogued every rule we were forced to break. I watched the sisters' faces for cracks in their piety, hoping for a glimpse of mercy that never came. I learned that the complex of buildings hid a basement used to punish the most difficult novices, those who protested, who faltered in prayer, who dared to hope. One stormy night I heard distant sobs and the echo of iron doors. From the crack beneath my door, I glimpsed Sister Agnes leading another terrified girl down a spiral staircase. The girl's shoulders trembled like a willow in the wind. My heart seized Teresa must be one of them. I lay on the floor afterwards, shivering, imagining a cell so dark the eyes accustomed to candlelight would burn. It was then I fully grasped how the American legal system rendered us invisible. We had no witness, no family advocate inside these walls. Even if we escaped, who would believe the stories of a scattered group of young novices who would dare challenge the Church's account of divine discipline? I thought of the Boston Archdiocese scandal I'd read about years before. Priests accused quietly transferred and shielded by lawyers. The parallels were unmistakable. Yet here in remote Montana, we had no journalists, no lawyers knocking at the convent gates. Yet survival demands more than truth. It demands strategy. I began to mark the linen cupboard for hidden tools. A worn hairpin Rose had slipped me from her brother's toolbox. A length of twine scrounged from the sewing room. I stored scraps of bread always under my habit for strength. In the dead of night, Rose and I whispered prayers, not of contrition, but of escape. Let this river of hope carve its way through these stones. Still, every day risked discovery. Sister Angelica paced the corridor, her heels echoing like a sentinel's drumbeat. Father Anselm's once weekly confessions became interrogations. He questioned my loyalty, probed for defiance, and graded my penance like a final exam. One week I nearly broke when he asked if I regretted missing my family. I nodded, but a spark of anger darkened my chest. Regret is the first step to rebellion, he sneered. The convent's abusers believed they were above reproach, shielded by robes and vows. But in my heart, I began to piece together the truth that we were collateral damage in a system designed to protect the powerful. And if the law would not defend us, we would have to save ourselves. On my 15th morning at St. Jude's, after a night of merciless rain that pounded the roof like 1,000 accusing fingers, I knelt on the cold floor and prayed for courage. Not for forgiveness, but for clarity of purpose. I whispered, God of mercy, give me the strength to endure, so I may straighten my back again one day. As dawn broke, I realized my faith had shifted. No longer was I praying to the abbey or the sisters. I prayed to the God I held in my heart, the one who valued compassion over cruelty, questions over unquestioning obedience. In that moment, I vowed I would survive this place not as a penitent novice, but as a witness. My story, our story, would one day burst through these walls. The convent's shadows might stretch long, but even the longest shadows disappear in sunlight. And I knew that someday soon the sun would rise for me again. Next, I will share how I and a brave few orchestrated our escape, smuggling hope down hidden staircases, navigating the darkness, and finding our way back to a world that had forgotten us. The night air in the convent was heavy with the scent of damp stone, yet beneath that weight lurked a current of hope that Rose and I had nurtured in secret for months. We called it our river plan, the idea that, like water finding a path through rock, we would carve our way free of these walls. It started with Sister Constance, the midwife turned friend who still laboured in the convent kitchen each morning. She was a quiet woman of deep conviction, her hands as steady over mortar and pestle as they once had been over expectant mothers' bellies. One afternoon, while folding laundry in the steamy basement room, Rose passed me a scrap of paper. Supply truck arrives at dawn, back gate keys in pantry. We had spotted Mr. Cecil's battered delivery truck enough times to memorize his route. He was an unsuspecting ally, Atlanta's most reliable vegetable supplier, who treated Sister Constance with respectful kindness. Our only job now was to ensure that when she slipped sedative into the tea, it was strong enough to send the other nuns into a deep but harmless slumber by midnight. That evening, under the guise of preparing for the bishop's inspection, Sister Constance slipped the set of back gate keys into Rose's palm. She whispered, "Be ready at 4. I've labelled each of you, memorize your sisters' faces." We slip away one by one. I tucked those keys into the lining of my habit, feeling their cold weight, like a promise. At 3:30 a.m., Rose crept into my cell. Her candlelight trembled as she mouthed our sisters' names. Teresa, Lucy, Joanna, 4 girls we had come to love. Each had a story of injustice. Teresa punished for tears, Lucy imprisoned for losing her baby. Joanna silenced for dreaming of college. We hugged, careful not to rattle the thin straw mattresses, and stepped into the corridor barefoot to soften our footsteps. The back gate stood past the chapel where centuries-old pews once felt sacred. Now its twisted iron bars represented our prison. Rose held the candle while I worked the lock with the hairpin. My breath came in shallow spurts as each click signified inching closer to freedom. Behind us, the faint snoring of Sister Angelica confirmed that the sedative had worked perfectly. On the other side, Mr. Cecil's truck engine rumbled like a sleeping beast. Under its tarp, straw and empty sacks offered us refuge. He loaded us in without a word, as if accustomed to transporting not just vegetables, but desperate hopes. The gate clanged shut, and as we bounced along the dirt road, I felt tears slip down my cheeks. Tears of fear, relief, and an ache so raw I could barely choke out a prayer of gratitude. By dawn, we arrived in Livingston. The sky was a pale promise of morning, and the bus depot smelled of motor oil and stale tobacco. Mr. Cecil handed each of us a wrapped sandwich, his quiet generosity in practice, and watched as we climbed aboard. "Stay together," he said softly, "and trust in the road." I wanted to hug him to tell him he'd undone years of cruelty, but I only offered a trembling wave. Atlanta greeted us with its sprawling skyline and tangled highways, a world away from the convent's mossy walls. We had no connections here, no safety net except the city's anonymity. Boards nailed crookedly over shop windows and neon signs flickering to life told us this place was both opportunity and challenge. We pooled the few dollars hidden in our bundles' coins from laundry tips, tattered bills slipped under pots. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Mrs. Matilda's boarding house, recommended by Father Jerome, awaited us on the fringes of East Atlanta. She was a broad-shouldered widow with sharp eyes, but a kind heart. 6 beds. 2 rooms, she said, as she eyed our anxious faces. $2 a night breakfast at 6. No one asked why 5 girls in threadbare dresses had suddenly appeared. In that moment, we were nameless wanderers, and that small anonymity felt like freedom. Our first priority was work. I remembered the hours spent sowing habits in silent sorrow, and I wondered if those practiced hands might now serve a new purpose. The day after our arrival, we found the Jackson Apparel Factory, a cavernous warehouse of humming singer machines and chatter. Mrs. Henderson, the forewoman, watched us line up. "You know how to sew?" she asked. None of us admitted our convent training, but we claimed experience. She eyed us critically before nodding. "Try Echelon 3. Echelon 3 meant basic hemming and stitching medical scrubs. Each of us took our machine its foot pedal cool beneath our trembling feet. The rhythmic clack of metal against fabric brought tears to my eyes. This time it was the sound of self-reliance, not forced labor. As my needle danced through turquoise cloth, I imagined it weaving a new life. At the end of the first week, our paychecks arrived $40 each, minus a few cents for thread. We pooled a portion to buy proper underclothes, simple cotton slips that clung to our curves and never pinched. Then we each bought a change of clothes. I chose a pair of navy slacks and a soft blouse, far gentler than my convent habit. As I dressed, I felt the rough edges of fear soften just a bit. Evenings were spent attending GED classes at the Atlanta Adult Learning Center. The room was lit with fluorescent bulbs and filled with adult migrants, veterans, single parents, all pursuing their diplomas. I sat next to Rosa, a Salvadoran immigrant, mastering English, and Joe, a Vietnam vet, brushing up on math. We shared stories over stale coffee, why we were there, what we hoped for. My confession that I'd escaped a convent seemed as improbable as a fairy tale. Yet they listened, nodding with the empathy only fellow survivors could offer. We studied multiplication tables, grammar rules, and historical dates. The Freedom Riders, the Civil Rights Marches. I saw echoes of my own fight for freedom in their lessons. When I learned that Rosa worked 2 jobs to support her children back home, I felt kinship in our struggles. By night's end, I would trudge home, my mind buzzing with algebraic formulas and newfound determination. Within months, we saved enough to rent a small 2-bedroom house on a quiet street near Inman Park. Joanna and Rose shared the front room. Lucy and Teresa took the back, and I claimed the loft, where a single window framed a slice of blue sky. We hung our pictures on the walls, a faded photo of John, smiling Teresa's childhood portrait, Rose's first GED certificate. The house was modest, creaky floors, a leaky faucet, but it was ours. Hope House, as we jokingly called it, became more than a home. Soon other survivors heard whispers of safe harbor and began to drift in. Patricia from Denver, Connie from Billings, and each brought her own story of escaped cruelty. We pooled resources, shared chores, and banded together like a makeshift family. On Sundays, we cooked communal meals, chicken and rice cornbread, stewed apples, and talked late into the night about our plans. I found work as an assistant teacher at the same adult learning center where I earned my GED. Watching my students grasp fractions, I remembered how terrified I'd once been of numbers. Now I guided others through multiplication tables, reminding them that every chapter of our lives could start anew. Rose enrolled in law school by day and clerked at a legal aid office by night, her fierce intellect carving out a path for justice. Joanna opened her own small art studio, teaching painting courses that doubled as therapy for other survivors. And Teresa began volunteering at a women's shelter, her gentle voice offering comfort where it was once denied. We formalized our effort into a non-profit, the Mary Liberator Association, named not for me, but for the many Marys whose spirits had been broken and rebuilt. We held weekly support groups in our living room, sharing stories and offering legal advice, GED tutoring, and basic job skills. Our network began to resemble the Underground Railroad, of old a secret but growing line of safe houses, lawyers, and sympathetic allies, determined to guide women from bondage into independence. Looking back, I see that our escape was only the first step. Rebuilding required courage of a different kind, the steady discipline of work, the humility to learn new skills, and the trust to lean on others. We discovered the American value of hard work was more than a cliché, it was a lifeline. We learned that community wasn't just a word, it was the fabric that could mend shattered lives. In the decades since, I have watched many graduates of our program step into stable careers, nursing, teaching, counseling. They call me Ms. Peterson with respect, but in their eyes, I see the same blend of fear and hope I carried off that truck. And on quiet mornings when the sun filters through the classroom windows, I remember the convent's cold floors and give thanks that the warm hum of our shared labour has become my new sanctuary. Next, we'll explore how our small collective grew into a movement, publishing the book that would amplify our voices, rallying public opinion, and navigating the thorny path of legal reform to ensure no one else would be forced to endure what we survived. The day the manuscript arrived in my hands, I felt a tremor of both excitement and fear. It was early 1986, and Rose and I had spent endless nights huddled over our kitchen table, transcribing stories from battered notebooks and scrawled scraps of paper. We called the draft Voices of Silence, our attempt to gather 5 decades of hidden narratives into a single unbreakable chorus. Now, fresh from the presses, its embossed cover felt almost too fragile for the truths contained within. Robert, the journalist, who had first believed our tale, arranged a small launch event at a local feminist bookstore in downtown Atlanta. The night was warm cicadas humming in the magnolia trees as we took our places on a low stage. I glanced at Rose, who wore her graduation gown from law school as a makeshift robe, an emblem of how far we'd come. Junior. Augustus, my former teacher and tonight's master of ceremonies, introduced us with a voice thick with emotion. "This book," he said, "is more than testimony. It is a map from darkness to hope." When Rose began to read Teresa's account of solitary confinement in the basement cell, her voice wavered and I gripped her hand. But as she spoke the words aloud, I watched faces in the audience shift from polite sympathy to outright outrage. By the time I read John's pharmacy visit to Promise Creek, how he was told I'd left this world, tears were flowing freely through the narrow aisles. A hush fell as I closed the book and looked up. We had broken through the wall of silence. In the weeks that followed, Voices of Silence circulated through university women's studies programs, reading circles, and human rights forums. The book never topped national bestseller lists, but it found its way into the hands of those who needed it most. Survivors in small towns, activists in big cities, and students writing papers on institutional abuse. Feminist scholars praised our blend of personal narrative and legal analysis. Religious reformers cited our work as evidence that faith without accountability could become tyranny. Yet for every note of praise we received letters of condemnation. Anonymous postcards accused us of slandering the church, of tearing at the moral fabric of America. Some trustees of local parishes wrote to demand we recant. At Hope House, the phone rang off the hook with threatening silence calls, dropped without a word, leaving only a dial tone that felt like a warning. It was Rose who calmed me on one late evening. She poured us cups of coffee in chipped mugs, and we sat in the living room surrounded by maps of church dioceses and yellowed legal pads. "They're scared," she said, her eyes steady. "Scared because we're waking up a sleeping giant." She reminded me of a lesson she'd learned in law school. Power fears exposure. If they try to silence us, she said we must speak louder. And so we did. We began hosting public readings at churches' community centers, and even in front of the archdiocese offices. We invited survivors to join us on stage, each offering a sentence or two of her story. The effect was electrifying. Individual voices that had once quivered in convent cells now spoke in unison, reclaiming their dignity. Meanwhile, Dr. Paul, our tireless lawyer, filed suit against the Archdiocese of Helena, not just for the Sisters of Divine Providence, but as a precedent-setting case against any religious institution that abused its power. He argued for a fundamental principle that no organization, however sacred, was above the law. The early hearings were discouraging. Judges warned of separation of church and state, and lack of standing brush-offs that echoed the convent's indifference. But public pressure grew. Margaret, the Boston survivor we'd met at an academic conference, testified about her own convent's silent records. Letters from readers poured in, offering financial help for legal fees. Even Father Jerome, the Atlanta priest who had sheltered us, wrote a heartfelt letter to the Archbishop urging an internal investigation. Faced with mounting bad press, the Archdiocese consented to mediation, and in late 1987, an out-of-court settlement was reached. It wasn't a mountain of gold, just enough to compensate the named plaintiffs and fund a new Victims Assistance Office in Helena. But the settlement included a condition we insisted upon the Church would finance free distribution of Voices of Silence to all public libraries in Montana and Alabama. That way, anyone who walked into their local library could read our stories, and the stories of others like us, without cost or censorship. When news of the agreement appeared in the Atlanta Journal with the headline, "Church Concedes Funds Healing," I thought I'd never see tears like that outside the courtroom. We gathered in the reception hall afterward, survivors and supporters, holding champagne flutes in shaky hands. A hush fell, then a ripple of applause that swelled into cheering. It wasn't a victory over one convent. It was a signal that truth could carve a path even through centuries of silence. In the years that followed, Hope House evolved into a network of support centers, 5 by 1995, stretching from Georgia to Texas, each offering legal clinics, therapy groups, job training, and safe housing. We partnered with the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence and joined the early #MeToo conversations, drawing parallels between religious coercion and broader patterns of institutional abuse. Our secret had become a shared cause: empowerment through community accountability, through visibility. We made deliberate choices to avoid common pitfalls. When new allegations arose against other convents, we resisted sensationalism. We insisted on corroborated testimony, medical records, and legal documentation, knowing that unfounded rumors could undermine real survivors. We offered media training to anyone who wished to speak, so that their voices would be heard with clarity and respect. In every press release, we led with compassion. Our goal is justice, not vengeance, a phrase that diffused hostility and invited dialogue. Our momentum inspired legislative efforts. Rose lobbied state legislators to extend statutes of limitations for institutional abuse, arguing that survivors often needed decades to find the courage to come forward. In Alabama, a new bill passed in 1992 granted an additional 5 years for filing civil claims explicitly mentioning religious institutions. This reform helped dozens more survivors bring cases against convents, seminaries, and even boarding schools. At the center of it all, I continued to teach. I developed a curriculum for high school seniors, Ethics, Faith, and Power, where students examined case studies ranging from the Holocaust to the Civil Rights Movement to our own stories at St. Jude's Abbey. We discussed how power can corrupt, how silence can harm, and how speaking truth is a moral imperative. Watching 17-year-olds debate these questions reminded me that the next generation might learn from our mistakes before repeating them. In 1995, I was invited to speak at the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing. Seated among Nobel laureates and heads of state, I told my story as if it were the story of every girl silenced by institutions. When I finished, delegates from at least 30 countries came forward sharing their own accounts of religious abuse stories from convents in Latin America, madrasas in South Asia, and seminaries in Eastern Europe. That gathering crystallized our understanding this was a global issue, and our small voices in Atlanta had become part of a worldwide chorus demanding change. Now at 72, I look back on that journey and marvel at how a single dance under an oak tree could set in motion a river of resistance. From the first trembling pages of Voices of Silence to the halls of power in Helena and Beijing, we transformed personal pain into collective empowerment. We learned that media, books, newspapers, television can be harnessed not just to expose wrongdoing, but to build bridges to compassion. And we discovered that policy reform, though, slow yields lasting protection for those who cannot protect themselves. If there is a mistake, I would caution against it, is believing you fight injustice alone. Solidarity is not optional, it is essential. Seek allies in law, in faith, in media, and most of all in the hearts of fellow survivors. Build communities that can withstand backlash and always document your work. Because truth, once set free, feeds on sunlight. It grows, it resonates, and eventually it changes the world. Our final chapter is still unwritten. As I prepare to pass the torch to younger advocates, I know the road ahead remains long. But I also know that every step we take in classrooms, courtrooms, conference halls is a brick laid in the wall of justice. And with each brick, we ensure that no girl ever stands alone in the shadows again.